The advent of modernity will bring fundamental changes to Jewish life, to Jewish society, and even to Jewish practice. The question is, when does modernity begin? And we'll look at two watershed events, the American Revolution and the French Revolution, but really it began before that with the Enlightenment. The ideas of the Enlightenment will lead to changes that will affect Jewish life and society, especially the assimilation of Jews into general non-Jewish society. We'll talk about the evolving of the Reform movement, and then the reaction to the assimilation and the anti-Semitic wave of the late 1800s. So the question is, when does modernity begin? So for Jews, it began well before the Enlightenment. You had the phenomenon of court Jews already in the 1500s playing a fundamental role. And here we have Don Yitzhak Abarbanel as one of the examples of a court Jew. He was in the court of Ferdinand and Isabella in Spain. And yet, even despite his great influence, he helped them bankroll their wars. He played a fundamental role as a financier. Nevertheless, he wasn't able to stop the expulsion of Spanish Jewry brought on by Torquemada, the Inquisitor, and by the church. Abarbanel then fled to Portugal, or was recruited there by the King of Portugal, who saw what a great asset he was, only to have the church Inquisition come to Portugal and the expulsion when he left for Italy. And he said that that was the best time of his life because he left his business pursuits and embarked on writing a commentary of the entire Torah and wrote a massive masterpiece work. So we have a Renaissance man in Don Yitzhak Abarbanel. Another great figure of the 16th century was Donna Gracia Nassi, who was reported to be one of the wealthiest businesswomen in Renaissance Europe. She rebuilt the Jewish settlements in Tiberias, loved the land of Israel. She lived in Germany, moved to Constantinople, and played an important part, like Don Yitzhak Abarbanel, in advocating for the Jewish people. And most notably, we're going to have a lot of men we're discussing, but we see great Jewish women as well playing a central role. In the 17th century, court Jews became even more prominent with the advent of the mercantile society. One notable figure was Samuel Oppenheimer in in Vienna, who funded the battle that stopped the Turks at the gates of Vienna in 1683. A socialite, well-known personality, person of extreme wealth, who played an important part in the empire of the Habsburgs. And yet, at the same time, at the end of his life, he was accused of improprieties, and especially with women and in business. And he was summarily hung on the gallows. And one can't help wonder whether other men had done such things, but not being subjected to what he was. When we come to the 17th century, we also see a phenomenon, not just in these court Jews, who were really the exception to the rule. They were given a special exemption because of their value to often the royal court. But we have certain pockets of Jewish life that becomes more free, particularly in Amsterdam, where there was freedom of religion. And we have here a picture of the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue, beautiful structure. The Jewish community was well integrated into Dutch society, served on the board of the Dutch East India Company. There are a number of Jews who did so. Prominent rabbinic figure was Rabbi Menashe ben Yisrael. And he was a converso. He was from a family that hid their Judaism in Spain and then were able to flee to Amsterdam, where he reasserted his Jewish identity, his family did, and he developed to become one of the most prominent rabbis of the time. And he was responsible for the Jews re-entering England, where we had been kicked out centuries before. And the argument he gave to Oliver Cromwell was this. He said that the Bible, the Torah, says that Jews must be spread to the four corners of the earth before the Messianic times. Now, playing off the Christian belief in the second coming of Jesus, he said, if you don't let Jews into England, they won't be spread everywhere, and the redemption won't be able to come. He was successful in his argument, and that reconstituted the Jewish community, or began the reconstitution of the Jewish community in England. Now, the movement toward modernity was called the Enlightenment, and you have certain figures like Baruch Spinoza, who one might call pre-Enlightenment, and yet already were using reason as the measure for human advancement and the measure to which to question everything from belief in God, how we understand God's functioning in the world. And his view is much more of a pantheistic view that God is nature, nature is God. And he was recognized generally as a philosopher. In the Jewish world, he was castigated because he started to question the divine origin of the Torah. And the 18th century will see a different type of enlightened Jewish figure. Moses Mendelssohn was a child prodigy, a brilliant mind, and it's said in their youth, he and Immanuel Kant, who were colleagues, he won first place in a philosophy contest over Immanuel Kant. He studied and wrote on general philosophy, but also particularly on Jewish philosophy. And he's a notable figure because he's often recognized or blamed, depending upon how one views it, as being the one of the figures in the launching of the Reform movement. Yet paradoxically, he was an observant Jew who had a lot of pressure to convert from non-Jews, prominent non-Jewish figures around him, the cardinals, and even he was promised a prestigious university position, a chair in philosophy, if he would only convert to Christianity. Yet he staunchly held to his belief and to his practice and refused. Yet at the same time, his views on Judaism reflected his age of reason and Enlightenment philosophy. And particularly one position he took was that his understanding was that reason could bring one to proper morality, such as Immanuel Kant also believed and wrote, and reason could bring one to God. Now, there were two paths. There was the path of reason and the intellect, and there was the path of the Torah, or revelation. And he said that as Jews, we were given this path of revelation. In a sense, we're given the tools of the Torah, and that is an extra tool. You could even say perhaps a shortcut to be able to take that path. And he once again advocated for Jews to stay on that path, but one can see how it would be a short step to then say, well, if both paths are valid, why should I do all the commandments of the Torah if I can achieve a relationship with God, closeness to God through using my intellect and through reason? Now, Rabbi Beryl Wine points out that Moses Mendelssohn was a genius. So if you're a genius, perhaps you can pave such paths. But for the ordinary people, his system maybe wouldn't work. And on another front, he also started to advocate for the Jew to adapt themselves to modernity. and particularly the idea that a Jew should be a Jew in the home, but a mensch in the street. In other words, religion becomes more of a personal, private matter, and that doesn't need to be worn on one's sleeve. And this is the beginning of what we call assimilation, of Jews integrating into non-Jewish society. And the question we're going to have to ask and face is that movement, while affording Jews great freedoms, because remember, until then, Jews had been relegated to ghettos. Jews had been forbidden in most professions, in the guilds, which were really what people aspired to, tradesmen, to be in the guilds. Jews could not own property and be farmers. And of course, the terrible persecution that went on throughout Europe. So given the choice of saying, would a Jew start to adapt to modernity in order to get out of the ghetto? This was a very difficult test. And we're going to see that there are two events that jump-started the integration of the Jew into general society. And those were the two watershed events of the Enlightenment, the American Revolution, and the French Revolution. Now, the American Revolution, the Declaration of Independence states, and here we have it, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. And of course, this is right out of the Torah, right out of Genesis. Man is created in the image of God, and therefore all men have this sacred nature, and therefore all men are equal. In addition, the Torah protects the rights even of those who are weak or disenfranchised. And the American version, of course, is the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But if there is right to liberty, then should not Jews be allowed to function completely in general society? Now, Jews arrived in the United States in the 1600s, when the Portuguese took over Brazil from the Dutch. Jews no longer could practice openly, and 31 Jews sailed from Recife, Brazil, to New Amsterdam. The mayor of New Amsterdam, Peter Stuyvesant, was an anti-Semite who wanted to not allow the Jews in, and if they're allowed in, to not give them rights to function in society. The Jews petitioned the Dutch East India Company and the Jewish board members and successfully countered against Peter Stuyvesant. And one figure, particularly Asser Levy, who petitioned specifically to serve in the militia, because he knew if he served in the military, that would be showed that he had a role in society. But it wasn't until the Constitution and the Bill of Rights in 1791 that outlawed religious tests as a qualification to hold office, that Jews will start to be completely accepted. And if a Jew can hold office, then certainly the assumption is that they would be citizens. Now, this was not explicitly stated, but it was implied. Before the Constitutional Convention, from 1776 to 1789, there was different reactions depending on the state. In Virginia, it took 7 years to pass the Act of Religious Freedom, giving Jews these rights. Yet at the same time, at the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia, rabbis marched arm in arm with ministers and all the people, and a special table was set up with kosher food for them. So American Revolution brought about the integration of Jews into general society. And there's one Jew who played a particularly important role in the American Revolution. That was Chaim Solomon, who was a financier and wealthy Jew. He bankrolled the revolution and helped George Washington to the tune of $600,000, which in today's sums would be hundreds of millions. The story was that Washington's troops were destitute, were starving, didn't have proper clothes for the winter, were running out of ammunition, and a messenger came to the Touro synagogue seeking Chaim Solomon. It was on the day of Yom Kippur. He immediately stopped services, made a pledge, and urged others to pledge for the cause. And after Yom Kippur, gathered the money, gave it to the messenger who brought it to Washington, and played a key role in the Battle of Yorktown over the British. Tragically, he died at 44 years old, destitute, never having been paid back for the money he gave for the cause. His descendants were not paid back after the war, and begrudgingly in the 1920s, I believe, a statue was put up of him in Chicago. So he played an important role, but did not get the recognition. In 1785, we already see European society opening up. Joseph II, who was the emperor or the king of the Habsburg Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, issued the Edict of Tolerance. And he declared that there should be no taxes, no special clothes for Jews. Jews were allowed into the trades and into university and could go to state schools. So you see already the beginning of opening up of society. Now, there's always a debate of what drove the change. And certainly it was the philosophy of the Age of Reason that played a key role, because it created a fundamental shift between the outlook before, which was really the people were there to serve the king, who was put in his position through divine fiat, through a godly appointment, and from there he derived his power and his authenticity and his authority. The philosophers of the Enlightenment, John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Voltaire, flipped that around and said, no, the state should be there to serve the people, not the people there to serve the state, and questioned the very foundation of what the purpose was of society. And also a drive to undo the inequalities in society. Now, in French society, these inequalities were particularly dramatic. When the people were starving, the French kings were building Versailles, these lavish palaces, leading lavish lifestyles. And the story was reputedly that when they came to Marie Antoinette, the queen, the wife of Louis XVI, and told her the people were starving, they didn't have any bread, she said, well, let them eat cake. That's how clueless she was. And the French Revolution particularly saw how injustice the system was, and with great hatred, they overthrew the Bastille, the fortress in the center of Paris. They overran Versailles and beheaded Louis XVI, and led by Robespierre, they championed a new slogan of liberté, égalité, fraternité, liberty, equality, which we see from the American Revolution, and also the idea of fraternity, of all people being together as one. And here you see Lady Liberty leading the people. I had to, and carrying the French flag. But you also see all of the dead bodies. And the French Revolution came at a great cost. It was called the Reign of Terror. The revolutionaries kept killing people, anyone who opposed them. And but in the National Assembly, where which had existed before, there was a debate, because if you're now calling for equality and you're calling for fraternity, then should Jews be accorded an equal place in French society? This was the question. And many of them argued that, in fact, they should. But one of the questions they had is, well, will Jews become Europeans? In other words, are they ready to enter European society and to live as Europeans, to not have different dress, different customs which separate them from the general society? Can they adapt to a universal education? And the answer to these questions were not known. The ghetto walls were torn down to great celebration, but it was really viewed as an experiment. There are those who were and here we see the General Assembly in 1789, and one of the debates was, well, if all humans are equal, are Jews human? And to their credit, most of them wanted to argue in the positive. One notable exception is Voltaire, great philosopher of the Enlightenment, who still harbored his anti-Semitic views. Jews are barbarous, crude, usurious, antisocial, and hated. But the changes continued. French society went through ups and downs and saw the reintroduction of an emperor, Napoleon, albeit of a very different type, not from the royal family. And his sense of government, he understood that if he governed the way the French kings had, with wielding his authority in a heavy way, that he might not keep his head on as they didn't. And his method of rulership was very different. He understood how to appeal to minorities, what we today would call minorities, interest groups. Said that in Egypt, he rode around on a horse with a fez and a jalabiyah. And here we see him on the left with the establishing Judaism as an official religion of the French Republic, which meant that the consistoire, the overviewing body, just as would service the Jews, just as the church serviced the Christians. So synagogues were funded by the government, rabbis' salaries were paid, and this is still today, until this day, that system is in place. But it was done with conditions. Napoleon convened a grand Sanhedrin of Jewish notables to ask them certain pointed questions about Jews' integration into French society. And the idea behind this was not just that he would ask the Jews a question, but by convening a grand Sanhedrin. Remember, this was the body that had sat in Jerusalem in the temple, and then it survived after the temple to write down the oral law. It was the greatest of Jewish sages, and it was the body that represented the Jewish people in their legislation and their judiciary, and had overtones of reestablishing Jewish national life. Now, for Jews, they must have felt like this is the advent of the Messiah. And some felt so strongly behind Napoleon that they were willing to, in a sense, put all their eggs in his basket. What were the things that he asked? So the body of the Sanhedrin was made up of rabbis and also lay leaders. So some of the questions were to the rabbis, their issue on polygamy, which was permitted in the Bible, not permitted in Christianity. Divorce, not permitted in Christianity, which is in Judaism. And the fundamental question he asked them is, are you French brothers or are you strangers? In other words, are you Jewish Frenchmen? You're Frenchmen who happen to be of the Jewish religion? Or are you French Jews? Is Judaism, is being Jewish your primary identity, and you happen to live in France? And of course, this is a very poignant question. To this very day, Jews who live in the diaspora really have this dual identity. And in a sense, every Jew has to ask himself, which is my most fundamental identity? So did put themselves behind being Frenchmen. They did, when asked, will you obey the laws of France, answered in the affirmative, that they would accept French jurisdiction. And they were asked, what is the authority of the rabbis? Now, the answer was really that they are ready to renounce their Jewish nationhood. And in essence, what they're doing is turning Judaism into a religion, not a national identity. Perhaps the most difficult question was the intermarriage question, which they really fudged on. The rabbis pulled back from answering this question, and the lay people answered, yes, Jews do marry French people. And it seems like there were some instances of intermarriage. They avoided saying that Judaism would advocate for this or endorse this, but by stating the fact that it did happen, in a sense, it was enough of an answer to be accepted. And so you have the movement of Jews being integrated into general French society. In the 1814, with the dissolving of Napoleon's empire, you'll have the Congress of Vienna, which will restructure Europe. And one of the articles introduced, Article 16, formalized the Jews' gains throughout Europe. That Jews could take an oath in court, a special oath, not on the New Testament. Jews could attend universities. Jews could serve in the armies and in different professions as well. And the changes were advancing. We see from this map that the actual formal acceptance of Jews as citizens still took a number of years, although we said in many places it was implicitly assumed, if not legally formalized, but the walls of the ghetto come tumbling down. And with Jews moving into general society, we will see the challenge of modernity, and we will see the challenge to Judaism, of Jews feeling they had to adopt not just in their functioning in society, but even in their religious life to the demands of Europe.